Okay. Okay, everyone. Can you hear me? It's always such a strange, like I'm too tall for this microphone. Um, well, everyone, hello. My name is Justin Reich, and thank you for attending tonight's event. I have to say, I'm very, very pleased to have so many people in person, and for those who are online, thank you very much for tuning in as well. So, my name is Justin Reich. I'm the director here of the National Church Leadership Center, but also the executive director of the organization you see, but behind our panelists, which is known as the International Churchill Society, which itself is a 501c3 educational nonprofit organization. Before I introduce the panelists, I'd like to thank the various organizations that have helped us promote this event, which is the Elliott School of International Affairs, the George Washington University History Department, the GW Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies, and the GW Cold War Group. How fitting for tonight. So I initially conceived of this panel discussion for multiple reasons, but mainly because I kept, probably like you, kept hearing commentators refer to America and China or America and this as the next Cold War. And so that prompted me to wonder, what are the lasting legacies of the original Cold War? And I think many of you would probably recognize the phrase, the Iron Curtain. That was, of course, given in a speech by Sir Winston Churchill in Fulton, Missouri in 1946. So there's the Churchill connection for tonight. And I'm sure he'll be brought up a few times, but we're going to talk about other types of legacies of the Cold War. So I thought, why don't I bring together some of the best experts in the field of Cold War studies to join me to answer this question. And I'll restate the question again. What are the lasting legacies of the Cold War? So I'm pleased to be joined by 4 faculty members from George Washington University. And unfortunately, there was one member of the panel, Aaron Bateman, who is unable to join us right now. So we've called someone up from AAA, and that is Dr. Anthony Eames. And Anthony, that was not because of your skill level or your knowledge, it was just simply because you were at a prior event. So you were a separate assignment before you came tonight. So we'll have about 40 minutes of open remarks from our panelists, and then we'll conduct a Q&A. And please raise your hand. We want you to participate. And my colleague Alice, who's sitting behind you, she'll run around a microphone when we get to that point. So here are the panelists. Dr. Hope Harrison is a professor of history and international affairs at George Washington University. And she's an expert on Germany, Russia, and the Berlin Wall. And Dr. Anthony Eames is a historian and lecturer of nuclear technologies and Cold War geopolitics. Dr. Gemma Santamaria is assistant professor of Latin American history and international affairs, focusing on violence, religion, and gender in Latin America. And Dr. James Hirschberg is a professor of history and international affairs and co-founder of the GW Cold War Group. So I will now invite Dr. Harrison to open the remarks, please.
Thank you. Well, first, let me thank Justin for this great idea. It's always a pleasure to collaborate with you. We've done multiple events since you took over this Churchill Leadership Center, and I'm glad to be part of this, and thanks everybody for coming. So I'll talk about I'll make 3 main points. Each of us has 7 to 10 minutes, so I'll make 3 main points and then 2 smaller points about legacies of the Cold War. The first is the very personal one of the leaders of the US and Russia, Biden and Putin. For most of Biden's career, or for much of his career, the Cold War was on. He was in the Senate, played an important role. So this old association of Russia as adversary is there. For Putin, younger, he too has a very important Cold War background. He was in the Soviet KGB, the Secret Service. And in fact, Vladimir Putin, the current president of Russia, was based as a KGB agent in communist East Germany at the end of the Cold War. So he saw communism come unraveling. He saw it right in front of him. He saw people taking to the streets and calling for the downfall of communism. He saw things spin out of control. And he saw the West and Western ideas take over in Germany. German unification in 1990 was carried out on Western terms, having been agreed to by East Germans who voted for that kind of outcome. Nonetheless, he witnessed this in a very, very personal way. After 1989, he went to Moscow and then St. Petersburg, where he watched the Soviet Union collapse. So while both Biden and Putin also lived through good times in US-Soviet and US-Russian relations, both at the end of the Cold War and after, it's very easy to slip into suspicions about the other side after the decades of the bipolar confrontation between the US and the Soviet Union. My second point is that the Cold War legacy has strongly influenced Russia's approach to Ukraine and Russia's concern about Ukraine's desire to join the EU and to join NATO. Obviously, during the Cold War, NATO was the enemy, the adversary. They frequently, whenever there was an anti-communist, anti-Soviet uprising in the Soviet bloc, whether that was East Germany in 53, Hungary in 56, Czechoslovakia in 68, they always said this is NATO, this is the US. And of course, that's what they're saying now. That's what they have been saying about Ukraine. And in fact, in the aftermath of the Cold War and the Soviet collapse, Russian leaders have tended to see any anti-Russian pro-democracy movements in the former Soviet space as fostered or even created by the US. This has happened in Ukraine, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and in Russia itself. The Soviet Cold War strategy of blaming things on the West or the US has come roaring back. My third point has to do with Germany, the legacy of the Cold War in Germany. Germany, of course, was divided for 45 years between the Communist East and the Democratic West. And Germany has some lingering remnants of this, including on policy toward Russia, toward NATO, and thoughts about democracy, thoughts about the war in Ukraine. The desire of many Germans, especially in the party ruling the country right now, the Social Democratic Party, to reach out to Russia and not close the door stems from the Cold War, feeling that to make sure West Germany had good relations with Communist East Germany, it had to go through Moscow, which led to Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik in the 1970s. Chancellor Olaf Scholz is a successor of Willy Brandt in the same party, and has many party members, regular citizens in Germany who still, in spite of the brutal war Russia's waging on Ukraine, who still think we live on the same continent, we've got to get along, we can't just freeze Russia out. The far right in Germany, the AfD, the Alternative for Deutschland, has strong ties to Russia, has gotten some Russian financial support. It is now the second most popular party in the country. And Russia uses this. Zelensky, when he addressed Ukrainian President Zelensky, addressing the German Bundestag shortly after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, referred to the history of the Berlin Wall. And he told the German lawmakers, don't leave Ukraine behind a new wall in Europe, a wall where it is stuck with Russia. Reach over the wall, help us so we are not stuck here. My two smaller points to make. We had hoped to also be joined by a colleague who would talk about the Middle East, so I'll just refer to that. Obviously, there are legacies of the Cold War in the Middle East now, with strong U.S.-Israeli relations established during the Cold War. And then the Soviets had strong relations with the Palestinians, especially beginning in the 1970s and 80s, arming them, supporting them, seeing that they were a liberation movement, an anti-West movement. So this dichotomy in how the US and Russia look at the Middle East goes on. Russia also has very strong ties with Syria, which it established in the 1970s, got its first naval base on the Mediterranean in Tartus, Syria. That axis, the Russian-Syrian axis, remains important. And my final point has to do more generally with the global South. Which was during the Cold War in many ways, and is certainly now anti-colonial, and somewhat anti-West and anti-US. And Russia plays into that, as it did during the Cold War. For example, most in the global South have not instituted sanctions on Russia for the war in Ukraine as the US and its partners have. Many in the global South feel the war in Ukraine is between whites in the North and that it's hurting the South. So with that, I will stop and hand it over to Anthony.
Thank you, Anthony. Just one thing before you begin is I just want to, first off, again, thank everyone for being here in person. I just want to acknowledge all the students that are here. I'm sure your professors agree with me when I say you're here for the subject matter, not for the extra credit. So thanks for coming. Anthony, over to you.
Okay, I think we're on. What I want to do is I want to break the legacies of the Cold War into 3 buckets, actually 4 buckets. And there's many more buckets you can break into, but we only have 7 to 10 minutes, so bear with me. I'll talk about the Cold War's legacies in 4 ways: the technological aspect, the psychological aspect, the institutional aspect, and then the idea of memory as policy. So first on the technological aspect. Now, there's any number of innovations that we can point to as legacies of the Cold War, right? We can pull out Google Maps, and that's a legacy of the Cold War. GPS, right, is a legacy of the Cold War. The internet, legacy of the Cold War. Hollywood films and special effects, legacy of the Cold War. And that's the kind of superficial fun stuff to talk about. But on a deeper level, what I think you start to see in the Cold War systematically take shape is the relationship between fear and innovation. You know, innovation at its heart, someone says to innovate generally inspires a feeling of optimism, right? With atomic energy, it was too cheap to meter, right? We're never going to have to pay energy bills again. But of course, with atomic energy, there was also the possibility of horrific apocalypse. And you start to see that relationship between fear and innovation can seep into other aspects of our life, and I think is now a permanent picture of our life. To take some recent examples, artificial intelligence, right? That's the most obvious example. We're thrilled with the possibility of not having to do the grunt work that would be assigned to an intern, and students are thrilled that they don't have to write their papers. But we're also thrilled or worried that we'll become obsolete as a species. And we're worried that country X, country Y, let's just say China and the Soviet Union or Iran, will get the leg up on AI. And when you couple that, of course, with quantum, that's a bigger nightmare. But it applies to other areas. You look at vaccines, pathogenic research, right? You would think that research into pathogens, into virus, to find a cure is generally a good thing. But of course, that comes with the possibility of biological warfare, which is something that's really a big concern in the Cold War and given the recent pandemic that, since you're all here, we all lived through. Clearly, those concerns continue to echo in ways that reinforce international rivalries between great powers. In this case, obviously, China and the United States. Even things like Bitcoin, right? And the possibility that Russia could use Bitcoin to finance terror networks, and Iran could use Bitcoin to finance terror networks, and yet Bitcoin could get you rich the next day, and you wouldn't have to work another day in your life. Fear and innovation are really very much present in kind of every groundbreaking technology that we think about today. And I'm not saying that didn't happen before the Cold War. You know, you think about Alfred Nobel and fertilizer and bombs, right? The Haber-Bosch process kind of led to both of those things. So clearly that dynamic had existed before in certain episodes, but not kind of systematically across all technology, it seems. Second is the psychological. What I really want to talk about here is the kind of mass disinformation environments that we all need to contend with on a day-to-day basis. I mean, it's exhausting. Now, prior to the Cold War, you know, propaganda, what people like myself would call public diplomacy, on a kind of nicer way of putting it, that was generally a wartime, hot war time activity. I mean, it did exist during peacetime in some instances, but you really put resources behind it during a hot war with another major rival. Now, with the onset of the Cold War, it becomes kind of the default strategy and tactic that you employ to avoid hot warfare, right? And certainly the playbook that you see Putin use, kind of getting Americans to distrust their electoral process, distrust the civic institutions and civic groups that lobby for certain political positions in the United States, whether you're for or against them. That's a playbook from the 1980s. In fact, even before the 1980s, when you think about the way he sought to kind of ferment the Soviet Union sought to ferment anti-nuclear activism, as opposed to in opposition to Reagan's nuclear policy. So, you know, you start to pick at a sentiment that already exists. But it already has to exist, then you can pick at it and make it worse and worse and worse. So the idea of hybrid warfare and mass disinformation environments is very much a Cold War legacy. The institutional can be taken a lot of ways. There are good institutional legacies. We're sitting in one. Universities, right? Growth of universities, area studies. These are all wonderful Cold War legacies. You know, the United States, I mean, you're number one in universities and military strength. Those are two things you're definitely number one in. And that's a Cold War legacy. But there's things that are kind of warrant more consideration, and that's alliance structures. Now, I say this as someone who's very pro-NATO, and NATO clearly is proving itself to be valuable yet again, as we now, confront Russian invasion, Ukraine, and ongoing war in Ukraine. And, Trump has led to some questions about the utility of NATO. But before the Ukrainian invasion, I would say that NATO had just become an accepted assumption on the world scene, the geopolitical scene. And NATO's kind of ongoing search for its reason for being was a big theme of the 90s and the 2000s, even during the war on terror, that seems to have been eliminated in the context of the Ukraine war, but I guarantee you will once again pop up in 10, 15, 20 years. But the idea that multilateral alliances are now a kind of permanent feature of geopolitics and professionalized as well is a legacy of the Cold War. And you see the spin-offs, AUKUS. You know, that is a legacy of the Cold War that is going to continue to ring well beyond our current lifetimes, probably well beyond our children's lifetimes, just in terms of how it affects industrial bases in the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, and perhaps Japan, Canada, New Zealand, if things progress the way that some suggest they should. Lastly, memory is policy. I, for one, hate the idea that we call a conflict with Russia or China a new Cold War, because it leads us to some really sloppy policy thinking. We kind of just do the cut and paste. Well, it worked in the Cold War, so it'll work today. And of course, we know that we don't have nearly, or the global economy is much more integrated today than it was in the Cold War. We know that on a person-to-person level and a culture-to-culture level, we're much more connected than we ever have been before. These cut and paste policies simply won't work. Now, there are certainly lessons you can draw from the Cold War. But we need to avoid the sloppy thinking that happens when we think of memory as policy. And it's not unique to the Cold War. In fact, it happened during the Cold War, right? During the Cold War, the memory as policy function was thinking about World War II, the appeasement issue. What has become clear to me now is it's not about the last war you fought, it's about the last great competition that you were engaged in. Because otherwise, 9/11, the subsequent war on terror would have kind of eliminated, wiped clean this idea that the Cold War should serve as the policy North Star for US action around the world, or the action of its allies around the world. And that's clearly not the case anymore. It's clearly still the Cold War. So a little deeper thinking on memory of policy is worthwhile. I think I've gone about 10 minutes, right? So I'll kick it over to my colleagues on stage.
Thank you. Andy, thank you. And how about just one comment before you begin? You were talking about how Cold War, the legacy of World War II, this was, of course, inspiring the actions of the Cold War. But rhetorically, you use a word that is a World War II hangover, appeasement. And that is probably going to last forever, just like Cold War. So it's just fascinating the rhetoric, the rhetorical, longevity and half-life of those words. I wonder what they are, probably 200 years. So, Emma, over to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here tonight. So I wanted to start this by saying that I'm a historian and sociologist who specializes on violence and crime in Latin America, with a particular focus on Mexico and Central America. So my remarks will be informed by my research and by some of the new historiography. I also should say that I am a Mexican scholar of Nicaraguan origin. I was born during the years of the Sandinista Revolution, and I'm a sort of product of Cold War politics since my parents had to leave Nicaragua, migrated to Mexico because of the Civil War. So that's just a prelude to who I am. So I would like to start by saying that in the Latin American context, there is no period that can be better captured or represented by William Faulkner's phrase, "The past is not dead, it is not even past," as the period of the Cold War in Latin America. If you open the newspapers today, you will quickly realize that Latin American countries, no matter how consolidated they are in terms of their democracies, and no matter their political ideologies of their leaders, they are still grappling with the past of violence, repression, and human rights violations that contributed to this period. You will quickly realize, too, that Latin American citizens are still demanding truth and justice for their family members and their loved ones. So just to provide a few examples, this past Sunday, as Argentinians commemorated the anniversary of the 1976 coup that lasted 8 years, Right-wing populist President Javier Milei called into question the number of 30,000 disappeared and downplayed the significance of the violence that took place during the military dictatorship. The Grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo, an organization dedicated to finding children who were stolen or adopted during the dictatorship, have denounced time and again these sort of denialist pronouncements and have insisted on the need to continue to fight for truth and justice in the country. They are fighting against a tendency to forget the past, but they are also fighting against a tendency to disappear the disappeared. Last year in Chile, under the leftist government of Gabriel Boric, when the country commemorated the 50th anniversary of the US-supported coup d'etat that toppled the government of Salvador Allende and inaugurated Augusto Pinochet's dictatorship, a new national initiative was launched to search for people who were disappeared during Pinochet's regime. Boric's government has nonetheless found resistance from the military to release key information. The disappeared and their families continue thus to struggle. And in Mexico, a country under leftist populist leader Andrés Manuel López Obrador, a country where, according to some estimates, there are over 100,000 disappeared since the Cold War, there are still hundreds of families that do not know what happened to their loved ones and that continue to demand justice. López Obrador has started to downplay the numbers of the disappeared and has failed to provide access to military archives that would provide information about the location of those individuals. Similarly, a truth commission created by his government to investigate the crimes that took place during the Dirty War have encountered multiple obstacles, and the military continues to behave with lack of transparency, lack of accountability, and discretionary rules. So in Mexico, also the disappeared are being disappeared. There are those many things that could be said about the legacies of the Cold War and about how cycles of violence of the past continue to reverberate today, although under different manifestations. But let me focus for the purposes of today's conversation in two specific patterns in regards to violence and repression: disappearances as a technique of terror and social control, and the design of security policies that respond to security threats via repressive, militarized, and short-term strategies that fail to tackle the social and institutional roots of violence. And this is basically based on Mexico and Central America. So during the Cold War, you know, Central American countries experienced a process of revolutions and counter-revolutions that involved bloody and non-armed conflicts, where violence was asymmetrical. Political dissidents, no matter how radical their ideas were, or how much they were or not influenced by international communism, were quickly repressed by political elites with the support of the United States, from the coup d'etat against Jacobo Arbenz to the contras that were financed by the United States in Nicaragua, El Salvador, amongst others. In this context, the aim and priority of the US government, but also of these elites in these countries, was to contain these threats, to avoid the so-called domino effect, and to avoid the presence of a communist threat in the US backyard. I mean, with little to no regards to the rule of law, to human rights, or to democracy. I mean, with some variations, of course, I mean, one US president and another. This is not to deny, of course, that the interests and responsibilities of Central American elites and Central American governments who also found this discourse instrumental to expand their political power and uphold their privileges as the social, political, economic elites that they were. So I always like to highlight the responsibility of these countries, of course, in the making of this crisis. In Mexico, a similar dynamic was at play, with the difference that Mexico was characterized by a one-party regime that kept the appearance of political stability and open elections in appearance, and some sort of like democratic opening, particularly in the 1970s. So Mexico was able to position itself as a progressive country in its diplomatic relations with Central America and Latin America at large, while internally it was repressing political dissidents. And as the new historiography has shown, Mexico was really not an exception during the Dirty War. Mexico was also carrying out forced disappearances and this flight of death that were perpetrated in other countries, salient in Chile. I'm not going to go into details, but there's also a new historiography that has documented how the intersection between Mexico's Dirty War and the war on drugs during the 1970s. Same military and financial support that the US was providing in Mexico to fight against the cultivation and trafficking of drugs was being used to repress peasants and guerrilla organizations in several states of Mexico. And again, because the priority for the US was to keep drugs out and keep Mexico as an ally that would keep communism from spreading beyond, at that point, the Central American countries, the US looked the other way in terms of how the Mexican government was using this military support. Now, where do I see the legacies in all of this? As you know, Mexico and Central America transitioned to democratic regimes, Mexico in the 1980s, Central America around the 1990s. In these new democracies, we no longer have guerrillas that are considered a pressing security issue, but we have instead drug traffickers in Mexico, street gangs such as Maras in Central America. Now, how have the governments reacted to these so-called threats? That's where I see the legacies. So the governments in these countries have, in general, repeated some of the same techniques of the past: containment, militarized repression, extrajudicial killings, and disappearances. In both Mexico and especially in the northern triangle of Central America, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, this has been done via US assistance. So as in the past, the US has tended to focus less on human rights and democracy and more in containing these sort of threats from US territory. Again, I can talk more about this, but US assistance has been provided in the case of Mexico through the Mérida Initiative, in the case, and now called the Bicentennial Framework, in the case of Central America via CARSI. Again, there are very many variations that I cannot capture in these few minutes, but overall, the US, through its assistance, which has been like military assistance, financial assistance, has privileged a perspective that provides incentives for these countries to tackle or to respond to these security threats via militarized short-term repressive responses. In countries that for which democratic transitions have been more than imperfect, this has meant that, again, these militarized responses have led to huge human rights abuses. So again, Mexico declared an all-out war in 2007 against drug trafficking organizations. Northern Central American countries since the early 2000s have implemented tough on crime measures, mano dura. You might have heard about Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador, famous for its Bitcoin and very famous for having incarcerated 2% of adult population in El Salvador. So again, there are many variations, but overall, there are like what I have called, together with my colleague Miguel Cruz, the new wars in Mexico and Central America, where these countries are not fighting any more political enemies, but they are fighting like these so-called criminals, but they are fighting them with the same sort of techniques learned from the legacies of the Cold War. Now, the reason why we see this is that, again, democracy arrived in these countries, but in a very imperfect way. No, I mean, we're dealing with the same sort of like, there were no reforms to the justice and security apparatus. There are no accountability mechanisms for the military. So it shouldn't be surprising, because we have this sort of institutional memory and institutional legacy of the past, where we have police that has not been reformed, military that has not been brought to justice, that are continue to be in charge of this sort of social control. So the last thing I would say is that, one can only hope that, the memory of the past and the knowledge that we have about the costs of the Cold War in terms of deaths and human rights violations allows us to say, to have a more critical approach to the social and institutional roots of violence that goes beyond this sort of like militarized short-term responses, and like a policy approach that would allow us to say never again and not under our name. Thank you.
Emma, thank you. Thank you very much. Had no idea 2% of the population of El Salvador has been incarcerated. That is absolutely exceptional. James, over to you. 10 minutes. Thank you very much. And then we're going to go straight to Q&A from the audience after James. So James, please.
So much. Just thank you for. I'll pop.
No.
Okay, fine. Okay.
No
time. Okay. Hello, everybody. Hello, everybody online. It's delightful to be here. Thank you so much for organizing this. I spent the last 40+ years studying Cold War history, starting when the Cold War was still going on. And while I'm also delighted to see so many students, I'm also delighted to see so many people who actually remember the Cold War. I feel like I'm at a Rolling Stones concert, and I'm dealing with students all the time who don't remember the Cold War, the Soviet Union as a lived experience. So, it's a real challenge to try to make it something that seems worth paying attention to, studying. And yet, one thing to make clear, I could literally try to give you another Cold War history legacy, not only every minute, but every second of the whatever's left of the 10 minutes that I was given. And one thing that's important to remember, and this is something that Hope and I have dealt with, to a lot of people, including some professors, Cold War history simply connotes, oh, that's US-Soviet relations after World War II. It's really a lot. It's 45 years of global history, political history, environmental history, literary history, cultural history, military history, technology, everything that was going on during that period is now understood to be part of the broader Cold War. And especially, just to take one, very significant example, there are some mentions to what's now fashionably called the Global South. What back then, and many of you remember, it used to be called the Third World. The first 20 years of the Cold War overlapped with a very enormously important and complicated process of decolonization. And really, you could almost view it as a double helix of DNA, the way Cold War history and decolonization history, which is sometimes, can also be lumped as imperial or de-imperialist history, we're not only revolving in parallel around each other and operating in parallel, but very much intertwined. And, there are many global East-West conflicts, but also regional conflicts in what is now called the Global South as part of decolonization, sometimes violently, of anti-colonial movements, sometimes with support from the communist world. But even that became more complicated because with the Sino-Soviet split, you sometimes had three-way conflicts of Cold War intervention of China, the Soviet Union, and the United States in a process that could be called, oh, this is just an anti-colonial conflict, but it's also a Cold War conflict. So it's incredibly complicated. Now, in terms of legacy, in terms of states, there are relatively few communist survivors of the Cold War that are still around after, 35 or so years. But, they include something that none of us are actually like the real experts on. In East Asia, you've got a North Korean government, a North Vietnamese government that is now, of course, the Socialist Republic of a unified Vietnam, and the PRC, although it is for 30 years cared ever since Deng Xiaoping much more about making profits than communist ideology, there is a continuation of that government. And of course, the Cuban government is a continuation of the government that existed since 1959 with Fidel Castro's revolution took about. And so, feel free to raise whatever you want in the question and answer, and we will try to deal with. But for what's left in my time, there are a few issues that I did want to talk about in particular. One is that there was a mention of alliances becoming an accepted part of the international system. This is one example where you could say, Santayana famously said, those who don't remember the past are condemned to repeat it. The George Santayana, the philosopher, and that's the cliche. Of course, history never exactly repeats itself, but it does rhyme. It does echo. There are patterns that either do perpetuate in history or influence subsequent events. And, the dynamic since especially Putin's invasion of Ukraine 2 years and a month ago, there is a reverberation of some Cold War dynamics. But I very much agree. There's a lot of sloppy usage of the phrase "a new Cold War." There's a new Cold War with China. There's a new Cold War. It gets thrown a lot around in just very superficial discussions of the world. When we all know as Cold War historians, there was a very specific circumstance of the division of Europe, the division of Germany, the division of Berlin. The communist side of the Cold War delegitimated in its ideology the relevance or legitimacy of the international state system. I mean, really, until Gorbachev's new thinking in the late 1980s, Soviet official ideology said, no, the world is based on the division of classes, not the interstate system. So one thing that's sloppy about much of the dialogue about a new Cold War that has been thrown around for many years was, there's no question that, especially after the invasion of Ukraine, there is a NATO-like resurgence and reaction to the threat from Russia that very much resembles the Soviet threat. But one thing that's very different is there's an ongoing, never-ending debate among Cold War historians about what drove the dynamic of the Cold War, specifically, especially what drove Soviet foreign policy. Was it ideology or was it geopolitics? Concerned with military threats, economic interests. Of course, the answer is both. But you do have people who do make the argument, oh, it's all this, it's all that. It tastes great, less filling. It can get very, polemical, but it's clearly in my humble opinion, a mixture, a combination of reasons, and really needs to be examined situation by situation. Just like those who say, oh, the US is always motivated solely by greed and economic factors. Well, sometimes it is. It's never oblivious to those, but that doesn't mean that's necessarily the most important reason the US acts in a particular way, in a particular situation at a particular time, whether it's intervening in Iran in 53 or Guatemala in 54 or Vietnam in the 60s. It's always more complicated than that. But one thing that's fairly simplistic about the current situation is Putin and Russia under Putin don't represent any particular global ideology that is seen as universalist, that could inspire revolutions around the world. I mean, he's out for Russian power and he's out for personal power, but that's not what the Cold War was. The Cold War was a mixture of these broad conflicts that don't necessarily exist now. And by the way, speaking of Putin, that's one example where Cold War history is relevant. But in my humble opinion, Putin, despite his very intense involvement with the end of the Cold War as a KGB agent in East Germany, the famous German Democratic Republic in the late 1980s, did not either understand Cold War history or simply has not been telling the truth. Because, of course, allegedly, one purpose of his invasion of NATO was because of the constant anti-NATO invasion of Ukraine was the constant anti-NATO rhetoric and blaming things on the West, NATO, the United States. But nothing Putin could have done could have more strengthened and unified, with obviously some little exceptions, like Erdogan and expanded NATO more than what he did. And this was very foreseeable. And the fact that Finland and now finally Sweden have joined NATO, which would have been unthinkable during the Soviet era, is not only a reflection of Putin either not understanding or not really caring about NATO as his motive, but also not understanding Cold War history, because repeatedly during the Cold War, and some of you are old enough to remember this, NATO was on the verge of collapse until the Soviets did something stupid like invading Hungary or invading Czechoslovakia or invading Afghanistan to remind everyone why NATO existed in the first place, and therefore provide an impetus to overcome serious internal divisions.
James,
Yes.
you got 1 minute. Just want to.
Yep. Anyway, just to get to my alleged topics, in terms of nuclear weapons, obviously, even though the breakthroughs in arms control at the end of the 80s under Gorbachev and Reagan and then George H.W. Bush got rid of roughly 80% of the nuclear weapons that the US and Soviet Union then possessed. Since that number was then so high, between 20 and 30,000 on both sides, there are still thousands of nuclear warheads that remain a legacy of the Cold War. And of course, we haven't talked much about China, but China is now building up. So nuclear peril is certainly a Cold War legacy that needs to be remembered. Another one, by the way, that is appropriate for this building, we're on the first floor. On the 7th floor of this library is a room called the National Security Archive, which has a fantastic website and is not to be confused with the National Security Agency, which is the government's it's the eavesdropping arm and intelligence detection agency set up by Harry Truman in 1952. The National Security Archive is the world's most important and the country's most important lobby against government secrecy and the excessive overclassification of government policy, government action is very much a legacy of World War II and especially the Manhattan Project.
James.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
But I will stop there and let you do that.
Okay.
If you
Oh, okay. Pick up your microphone and get to your last
Yes.
point. Yep.
No, another example of how, again, history rhymes but doesn't repeat itself is one thing we could count on during the Cold War for 40 plus years was in American domestic politics, which is, of course, a crucial influence on American foreign policy. You could always count on the Republican Party as being more hardline anti-Russian, Russian then also meaning anti-Soviet, than the Democrats. And the Democrats, especially after elections, like 72 with George McGovern, would always have to fight to convince the public that it could be, a reliable Cold War governing party. But it was always lagging behind in terms of American domestic politics. What has happened in the last 8 years since who became president in after the 2016 elections is an example of discontinuity because the Republican Party is now no longer the reliable anti-Moscow, anti-Russia force that it was. And this oddity of the political right, and Hope mentioned how in Germany, the political far right is reliably getting supported by Putin. And so, this is an example where a Cold War dynamic has crucially potentially changed. And of course, this is having a significant effect already on US policy with the delay of action by Congress to support Ukraine. Okay, thank you.
James, thank you. And thank you. So if everyone would again, join me in thanking these professors. I mean, these are experts in their field. They're here with us tonight, and it's a pleasure to have them. Thank you again. Okay, so we have plenty of time for questions. Here's how we're going to handle it. I need everybody with their listening ears on, which is what I say to my 2-year-old and 4-year-old. The thing is, I'm going to try to get everybody, raise your hand. Please do me 2 favors. One, just say your name, and then ask a precise question. We don't have time for statements. So who would like to start? And if I don't see a graduate student, okay, you right here. Whatever you feel comfortable with, but name, precise question.
Hi, I'm Ishan. I'm not a graduate student. God, so many questions I could ask, but for you, Dr. What was okay, Jim, you mentioned that something today is there's not as much ideological tension between great powers as there was during the Cold War. Something you've seen as of late from China is attempts to kind of build a more sort of globalist narrative with their global security initiative and stuff like that. Do you see that as an attempt by Communist People's Republic of China to create an ideological counter narrative to the United States?
In their dreams.
Jim, use your mic and then precise question, precise answer.
In their dreams, they would love to create a Chinese narrative that has global appeal. But just like another thing we didn't even get to, the cultural competition of sides in the Cold War was very crucial to the outcome of the Cold War. And China has never become a significant actor in terms of global popular culture. It frankly is still trying to get up to the level of South Korea in terms of videos and music and things like that. So yeah, sure, in their dreams, but they are, that is very much limiting China's aspirational influence. And I think it's much more focusing on its economic power and to considerable its military power, even though it would love to project, what is, the cliche soft power, simply by having such an expanded influence through economic aid and a presence, that it can have influence in a much broader array of countries from South America to Africa to all over Asia than it did during the Cold War.
Jim, thank you. raise your hand, Alice. There's a gentleman with, right, yep, second row. Thank you. Name, precise question.
Hi, my name's Nick Camargo, and my question is about several of you mentioned the alliances. Obviously, NATO's a big one. And we all saw the last 2 years the struggle to get Finland and Sweden to NATO because two very stubborn gentlemen, Tayyip Erdogan and Viktor Orban, for various reasons delayed it. What would you say is the strength that NATO's had to deal with these deeply frustrating actors that, in comparison to CSTO, I mean, I think I saw the Armenian PM say, yes, last week that Armenia would leave if the CSTO did not do more with Azerbaijan. What has been the resilience of NATO to deal with incredibly frustrating leaders in Hungary and Turkey, while Russia's version of NATO seems to be falling apart
Thank
since the
you.
war in Ukraine?
Jim, since you already answered, Hope, would you like to?
Yeah, great question. The resilience of NATO, that it keeps going and in fact has expanded. Just the power, putting all those countries together with their military forces and multiple nuclear powers being in NATO. There's just no group that can compete with it. Now they had to negotiate, obviously, with Turkey and Hungary, and that can be a problem. Needing a unanimous agreement to expand NATO, but I would say just the sheer power of what it is and for how long it's been, and combined with the sense of, especially because of Russia's war on Ukraine, as Jim said, new life has been breathed into NATO, and many countries feel absolutely adamant that their defense depends on NATO.
Yeah.
Quick comment, and then you want to. Yeah, okay, go ahead, Jim.
Yeah. Hope is, of course, absolutely right about all the power, but that power only works if the other side believes you will actually use it. And if you know who wins the election this year, I am sure Putin would not believe at all that, say, invading the Baltic countries, which of course are members of NATO, unlike Armenia or Georgia or Ukraine, and especially in the case of Estonia, have significant Russian Russian populations. I'm sure Putin would love to invade those countries and basically see if NATO has the nerve to seriously use that power. And the Korean War came about because Stalin mistakenly misjudged American public opinion and misjudged Truman and approved North Korea's invasion of South Korea, thinking the US would not intervene. So the power only works if the other side believes you have the willingness to use it.
Thanks, Jim. Anthony?
There's two other things I'd add to that. One, we're at a point where institutionalization is so deep that it's not just at the level of political elites. I mean, you look at NCO class in the US military and the peer militaries across the Atlantic. I mean, there's real cooperation at the lowest levels of that alliance, not just on a military level, but a civil level. Two, NATO didn't happen in a vacuum. Right? Like, a lot of the key moments in NATO happen in parallel with key moments in European integration in the economy on matters of science and technology and space race, especially the British application to join the European market, which of course is on the way of the dinosaur. But the fact that NATO and military integration and economic integration became reinforcing mechanisms is something that the Russian system never really could get to work, right? Because there was not that economic engine behind military integration in the same way. So that's bodes well for NATO's future, one might say. I'll leave it at that for now.
Any more questions? Did you have your hand up? Okay, so here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna take two questions from this side at the same time. So Alice, we're gonna have this lady in the front ask hers, and then I saw PHO with his hand up. So Alice, bring the So you're gonna ask your question, please state your name, and then before they answer, we're gonna have somebody ask another question.
My name is Doris Dixon, and I saw the Beatles in 1966, so I'm older. And I think of the Republican Party as the party of Lincoln and Reagan. And I'm astounded that the former President Trump can say that he encourages Russia to invade countries that don't pay their dues to NATO, that he doesn't think NATO's. Do you, and then also the House Republicans don't support continued funding for Ukraine. Is it because there is so much distance? They're so much younger that they have a distance from that relationship, the Cold War that we all knew.
Doris, great question. Pietro, if you want to ask your question, if you want to stand up. Thank you, Pietro. Microphone.
Thank you. One of the most potent phrases I heard was the disappeared have been disappeared. And that really made me wonder, what is the role of national sort of shame and embarrassment in how we engage with the Cold War, both as historians and as politicians?
Great question, Pietro. I think let's start with that one. Hema, would you like to reply to Pietro's second question? Whoa, Jim. Yeah, we'll have Hema answer. I'm doing this backwards now. Pay attention. Hema, can you answer Pietro's question about?
Of course. I mean, thank you for that question. And indeed, like the disappear and the disappear. I mean, it's one of the most brutal. I mean, this forced disappearance is one of the most brutal and dramatic forms of violence, right? Like you deny a person the opportunity to mourn the dead, to remember the dead, to visit them in some grave. But now, like adding to that, the question of even disappearing them in the collective memory. So I think it's a huge. It's a huge tragedy in these countries. I do think that, like part of it has to do with the sort of like this sense that we want to move away from this past because this past is shameful, and many Latin American countries want to see themselves as new democracies that are thriving, and that this, again, like this past is in the past. I mean, and a lot of the reaction that the mothers of the disappeared receive in Chile, Argentina, in Mexico, is that why are you trapped in the past? No, look towards the future. No, I mean, so there is a certain reluctance to, as if dwelling in this memory would be being backward looking instead of forward thinking. So I think there is an element of that, and there is also an element of, as I was mentioning, like the institutional legacies and the sort of complicities of the military. I mean, again, we need to understand that the democratic turn in Latin America was far from perfect. No, so it is the same security and justice apparatus that never was modernized or reformed that is in power today, and that is why, as historians, we need to keep pushing and demanding for the opening of those archives, so that we can know the full extent of the military repression, of the forced disappearances, but that also, as I ended off my remarks saying, that we don't repeat those things, and that we don't keep reproducing that violence. Thank you.
Emma, thank you. And here's what I'd like to do. We're just about over time, but I'd like all panelists to respond to Doris's question. You don't have to necessarily respond particularly to the Republican Party, but I really liked the last part of her question, which is, are lawmakers today, particularly in the United States, too young to understand the ramifications, the legacy? So as practitioners, when you deal with students, how do you respond to that last part? But of course, if you want to tackle the Republican question as well, I'm going to start with Jim, and we're going to come all the way down and end with Hope.
Okay. Naturally, one could talk for many hours about the question you've raised, and obviously the receding of the Cold War into history. It's like any active history that recedes generationally. America is famously ahistorical. I remember when I visited Budapest in 1989, and you had the anti-communist revolution, and people were still inflamed by memories of 1848. I mean, and I remember being a reporter in Israel and going to the new something, like a new gate in Hebron that was only 500 years old. So, other countries, I mean, I remember hearing about when I was a kid, the definition of short-term, medium-term, and long-term policy was, short-term was for the evening news, medium-term was for the next day's Times, and the long-term was for Time or Newsweek. So Americans are famously ahistorical. But frankly, a lot of the Republicans know better. When you have, people like Lindsey Graham and stuff like that, They just care more about their own personal ambition and comfortable circumstances than they give a damn about principle. They don't care about democracy.
Jim, thank you. Emma, please. Okay, Anthony, go ahead.
First off, I think it's important to remember that people disagreed about the Cold War along generational lines during the Cold War. Now I will say this as someone who was born during the Cold War, but doesn't much remember the Cold War personally. I mean, you look at the end of the Cold War, the 1980s. I mean, you look at who are the people in Central Park rallying against nuclear weapons, the largest protest in American history at that time, and still maybe, depending on how you count protests against the Iraq War, they were remembering the Vietnam War. Am I right, Jim? Were you there? I think we had this conversation. I thought I recalled you saying you were. Yeah. And so, they're remembering the kind of excess of American military power in response to Cold War imperatives. And that's the reason they're against the bipolar Cold War framework. But then the generation that is, behind Reagan's peace through strength policies is really remembering an era of decisive American intervention in the Cold War, the Marshall Plan, right? The Iranian coup, the Guatemalan coup, the Berlin airlift, all kind of supported by the American atomic monopoly. So, the age thing also played in the Cold War. But on the generation of Republicans, I mean, we'll say this, not to be tongue in cheek, but the last I checked, the people who were leading, the beating the drum against NATO and were being friendly to Russia are people who were very much adults during the Cold War. And so I don't think it's an issue with the younger generation being doubtful about, great power conflict. Now I know there's some stats on kind of younger Republicans are more likely to not see Russia as a threat. That might be I think there's speculation that can be had, probably not in a good way on that. But on the generational issue, I think it's really that Americans have lost trust in their institutions. So how can you trust the institution of government to carry out a defensive policy against another great power rival, right? And then our political communities are structured around information space on TikTok or on, Instagram, rather than geographical place, like in your local civic center, church, what have you, right? And so I think that's the detachment that's making this, who's the bad guy question so tough to grapple with.
Thank you, Anthony, and we'll end with Hope.
Yeah, great question. I too, my first thought with about your question is, well, the leaders are mostly, older Republicans who know full well what happened during the Cold War. So I don't think it's so much that. Well, I know, but yeah. But I think that this gets at a deeper issue, which is discussions about the US role in the world generally. And I mean, this is an old question in US foreign policy. How much do we engage abroad versus how much do we just focus on what's going on here domestically? And Trump has clearly tapped into that and made many people think that, yeah, we should focus at home and we shouldn't, it's not for us to take Ukrainian chestnuts out of the fire. So I think this is a broader problem that our politicians really need to grapple with. I guess I would also close with two comments that came from things that have been said about whether there's this new ideology, whether China has a new ideology or Russia. I mean, Putin is actually trying to unite everybody, not with a positive ideology, be with a negative one. You know, we're against the decadent West. We're against the hypocrisy of the US that says one thing and does another. And that gets a lot of people in the global South, et cetera. And finally, it was mentioned really quickly by Jim as a throwaway, but another legacy we all need to keep in mind of the Cold War, the environmental legacy. The legacy of the nuclear arms race environmentally and how that impacted people in the US, particularly Navajos in the US. Obviously, people around Chernobyl, people in Uyghurs in China, and other groups who didn't have a voice to speak up against where nuclear testing took place. So we're living with so many legacies of our Cold War, of the Cold War, that are going to go on for a long time. So thank you so much, Justin, for bringing us together to talk about this.
And thank you, everyone. And before we give everyone one more round of applause, let me remind everyone in this room that the next event being held here is April 17th, and that is on a completely unrelated topic, Winston Churchill and the American Civil War. So look for that. But please join me in thanking our guests.
No.